Yeah. Everyone online?
Right, if everybody's ready, this is like the scene in The Witches. We're going to lock the doors. I'm so glad that enough of you are of a certain age that you get that reference, or you're possibly thinking of the revamp of it. I'm also very excited for the two men standing at the back looking slightly nervous. You're very welcome, gentlemen. There's a seat at the front if you want to come and join us. We love a token. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about today's discussion because I think, not least because I think this is a panel that could win any pub quiz going, the level of expertise and the range of expertise here. What I'm going to start with doing, I'm Stella Creasy. You'll be very pleased I'm not actually going to speak today because I recognise when I am in the presence of people who know a lot more than me. Women often do that, don't we? We've got a fantastic panel to talk about the gender data gap and what we can do particularly about that. I'm going to start by introducing a powerhouse, which is Dr. Liz Hines. You will be a professor eventually. I know you will, but if only for the moment when you have that conversation with the bank manager, when it's on your card. Liz is the Partnerships and Training Officer for the Women's Budget Group, which is obviously the reason why we're all here today, and the fantastic Marianne, who I can't wait till you get your knighthood, because it's long overdue for the work that you do. She has a passion for maths education, and previously worked on STEM issues for the British Science Association and has published a book called Enriching Maths. This event was her idea, so I'm going to hand over to Liz very briefly to set out for you the research that she's been conducting on the development of a sub-national gender equality impacts for Great Britain. Oh, sorry, no, that's Caitlin. I'm doing really well today. Look, this is why I'm not speaking. But Liz is just going to talk about the Women's Budget Group, and then we're going to move on to Caitlin. So over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Okay, I have some slides. Okay, so, as Stella says, I came up for this idea, and it's been months in the planning this, because I first came up with the idea for this event when the first release came out of the initial census data, which was long before Christmas. Because the top-level data about census came out, which just showed demographic information, and it was noted that our birth rate had dropped. Cue several op-ed articles in newspapers written by men going, well, I wonder why that is. Maybe we should start taxing the people that aren't having babies. Yeah, that's it, that'll fix it. And I thought, well, when is somebody going to ask a woman? Because we might have other ideas, like, wouldn't it be nice if we could afford a house with our hypothetical child in it? That would be a good idea. And, maybe the two-child limit might be somewhere that you might like to start to encourage us to be having our babies so that we can afford them. But no, that didn't appear. And I thought, what we've got here, it's not a gender data gap because we've got more data in the census than we know what to do with. What we've got here is a gender data analysis gap. And I thought, well, we can do something about that. And I thought, wouldn't it be marvellous if we got together this group of women who've got lots of different experiences and perspectives on the actual issues and what's going on, and we get you together in a room, feed you on some census data, and see what happens. And that's this. Hello, this is today. This is what we're going to be doing today. Some of you on the left-hand side there are looking a little nervous now because that's the group of women that we've got today who will be spending this afternoon going downstairs, and we're going to spend the afternoon looking at the data with a little bit of training and analyse it. And I'm just absolutely chuffed to bits that weird idea that I had 6 months ago is actually about to happen. And we've got women here who are volunteers that have taken the day off and have struggled down on the train to be with us today. We've got some academics, we've got some media people, a whole range of different wealth and experience of the issues so that we can sit down together, look at the data, and try and understand what it says. because, you know, we're being bombarded with data all of the time. Women's Budget Group, we have our own research team, but they can't possibly hope to look at all of the data that's being produced, and they can't possibly hope to understand what it's all trying to tell us. And then on the other flip side, you know, with this cost of living crisis, you've got numbers in the news all the time, and particularly economic numbers like, you know, GDP, inflation. What are these things? What do they mean? And the Women's Budget Group, that's why we exist. We're kind of that middle ground. So we like to say we'll put the women's movement into economics because it desperately needs it, but we'll also help you put the economics back into the women's movement through me and doing sort of capacity building work and training opportunities. Because we know you don't have to be a maths whiz or an economist. You certainly don't need to have done maths to the age of 18 in order to look at what's going on. So, for example, take that hypothetical woman trying to find somewhere to live with her child. We have resources available written by a lovely colleague of mine, Emma Thackeray, who's looking shifty by the door. But we'll take you through exactly where the data is, because that's the difficult bit. Where's the data set? And we'll show you how you can take an area, for example, Waltham Forest, and you can look up a woman's median full-time annual salary in Waltham Forest is £37,856. Okay? The rent for a two-bedroom property for her and her hypothetical child, £18,000 a year in London, and you know, upwards. You don't have to know any maths at all to know that those two numbers, they don't compute, do they? And you know, this is what we're trying to do with today, is to take this sort of analysis and say, well, what are the numbers that are important for women in the census? Work together and pull that into something that we can use. So, for example, you know, here's some I did earlier. Who cares who's doing unpaid care in England? Well, you know, we can measure how much more of it is done by women, and we can drill down into that as well to look at it by local area. If you're interested, you can do pretty charts like that without too much difficulty, that breaks it down by age and looks at the unpaid gender pay gap by age. You know, the census data is an enormous data set, 51 questions, and for the first time with census data, it's possible to build a custom data set so that we can sex disaggregate our data, and we can look at it intersectionally as well. And the more women's eyes on that we get, the more of that analysis that we can do. And the more we can do in our campaigning, the more we can talk about our issues, and importantly, the more ammunition we can give to our elected representatives so that they can actually do something about it for us. And apologies to people at home and people who aren't joining us for that session. We do offer free training. There's my details. Email me, and I'm quite happy to come and talk to you about data some more and to run some events like this for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So the premise of today is a bit like deconstructing DNA or winning a World Cup. We need women in this country to do it. I am now going to pass over to Caitlin, who is a research fellow at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College London, working with quantitative data to uncover and challenge gender inequalities in economy and society. Her PhD examined the construction and policy use of gender equality indices with a particular interest in the measurements of unpaid work. Mine looked at how biscuits made meetings better, so I think probably on balance, Caitlin will make a bigger impact. I'm going to hand over to Caitlin, who's currently working on this idea of a gender equality index for Great Britain to measure and compare gender equality levels across different regions and local areas. Caitlin.
Thank you very much. Hello, I hope you can hear me. Such an honor to be on this panel today. Thank you so much. As Stella said, I'll be speaking to you about a project we're working on at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which is on the measurement and a mapping of gender inequality across the UK, and is funded by the Lloyds Banking Group. So as people in the audience here are surely well aware, gender inequality remains a persistent problem in the UK, affecting multiple dimensions of women's and men's lives, from differences in pay to differences in unpaid care, and the prevalence of sexual harassment and violence. Mounting evidence shows that gender inequalities are experienced differently across local areas. And since, according to the IFS, the UK exhibits some of the highest levels of regional inequality in the so-called developed world, information on how gender differences vary across the UK are critical. Yet, to date, efforts to measure gender inequality primarily take the form of global indices, masking wide subnational variation. And moreover, these indices are not necessarily tailored to the gender inequality context of the UK. And where local data does exist, it is often not easily accessible, as Liz mentioned. We argue that, I'm really messing this up. And we argue that to evaluate and develop effective policies that can increase gender equality in the UK, it is critical that we can measure and monitor gender equality levels across the UK over time. So to give you an example of the importance of looking below the national average, if we look at gender employment gaps, so that's the difference between men's and women's employment rates, we see that there's strong variation across the UK. It varies from 3.5% in Scotland to 6.3% in the Northwest, up to 9.3% in London. Now, if we dig deeper and look at the local authority level, taking Manchester as an example, we see that this varies from 2.3% in Trafford to 8.3% in Manchester, all the way up to 15.3% in Rochdale, which is more than double the GB average. So with funding from the Lloyds Banking Group, I'm leading a project to address the existing gap in the UK. And we want to develop a subnational gender equality index and create a resource for measuring and mapping gender inequalities in different domains on the local level. We want to develop an index that combines existing data and including the multivariate data that is now available through the Census 2021, which is just an invaluable resource for this kind of work. We want to develop a benchmarking tool for research and policy evaluation and development. And also centrally, we want to create a user-friendly website that collates all the existing data and makes it easier to access, analyze, and interpret gender inequalities in the UK. We have a 5-stage project, the first 2 of which are slowly completed. We developed a conceptual framework by speaking to academics, representatives from equalities organizations, as well as policymakers to come up with the conceptual framework, what dimensions we should be looking at. And then also we spoke to colleagues at the ONS to figure out what data is out there, how can we match that up with the ideal framework that we want. We identified 5 core domains: paid work, unpaid work, money, power and participation, education and skills, each of which will have subdomains. Then also we want to have satellite domains that focus on women-specific issues relating to health and also violence against women and girls. Through this exercise, these first 2 stages, we saw that having intersectional gender inequality analyses is difficult, especially if we want to look at the local level. Often you can't combine different characteristics, it's either one or the other. But the census data is really a big advantage in this regard, even though it doesn't cover all of the indicators we would like to include. There's still limited data on violence against women and girls, and also the time spent on different forms of unpaid care. We've also noticed that data on Northern Ireland is limited, so the index will likely have to focus on Great Britain rather than the whole of the UK. And so we see a need for greater collection of gender disaggregated data covering all 4 nations of the UK, and that are consistent or measure with consistent geographical units and sample sizes large enough to permit intersectional analyses. We want to insist on a comprehensive framework because we know that even if we have gaps and we can't add that data yet, if we point to areas where there are gaps that are policy relevant, greater support can be mobilized for closing these gaps. Once we've integrated all the existing data and constructed the index, our aim is to develop an easily accessible website for exploring patterns of gender inequality at the local area level. We believe this index can serve multiple purposes for a range of users. We hope it can support the work of advocacy groups and might be especially useful if they are campaigning on a local area. We hope it will inform research and also policy considerations. We hope it can strengthen dialogue between local authorities, facilitating knowledge sharing of initiatives that are useful. And this is especially interesting in the context of devolution. We hope it will improve access and the usability of existing data. And also, as I mentioned, we want to create an advocacy tool to show how we want to highlight data gaps to advocate for greater data collection so we understand how the lives of men and women in the UK are structured across different regions. So, thank you very much. If you want to get in touch, these are my details.
I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly excited by the work that Caitlin's doing, because for me, what she's going to do is answer what I call the Klingon moment in Parliament, and I think at a local level too, which is that when you mention anything to do with women, ministers hear the word woman, and then they think you're speaking Klingon. Because the next thing they will answer your question with is whatever they know about women or ladies. So I've got up in Parliament and asked questions about things like small businesses and women, and got answers back about the gender pay gap. And you think, no, that's not what I asked. But literally, the minister's heard lady, and then everything else is Klingon. Because the second point about this is that accountability about the data that we do have is poor. We know that during the pandemic, gender pay gap reporting was the only thing that the government decided wasn't important enough to keep going. We know that they are long overdue, almost a year now, their accountability in their own papers about publishing that data and publishing the review of the data. And we know that further progress, whether it's on the ethnicity pay gap or disability pay gap, has been basically shelved. So what Caitlin is doing is not only arming people like myself, but she's also shining a light on our failure to recognise that the heart of this is a lack of understanding about the talent and potential and inequality as a result of the failure to understand those differences that is coming in this country and how it's holding us all back. Two women I know that more than most because they've lived and breathed this issue are our next speakers, and I'm going to invite both of them to talk. I would like you all to know Caroline Criado-Perez is my failed master's student. I tried for years to mentor her to write her student. She went on to do a few more important things, and I think it's now at the point where I have to finally accept, Caroline, that you're not going to do the masters I was hoping that you might do, because actually you have fundamentally changed the world in the way in which it thinks about these things. If you're not aware of Caroline's work, I don't know what you're doing in this room, because you really should be. Not only does she already have an OBE, for goodness sake, I mean, how old?
Let's not go into that.
She wrote the incredible book Invisible Women, which absolutely broke open people's understanding that this wasn't just about the gender pay gap, it was about the systematic exclusion of an understanding of women's experiences and the diversity of women's experiences in everyday life. That book has now been translated into 30 languages. She won the 2019 Royal Society Science Book Prize, the 2019 Books on My Bag Reader's Choice Award, and the 2019 Financial Times Business Book of the Year. You didn't even tell me about that one, Book of the Year award. She is the recipient of the Liberty Human Rights Campaigner of the Year award and got her OBE in 2015. In 2020, she was Finland's Han Award Report for Opposing Equality. In 2021, she received an honorary doctorate.
It's the same thing.
From the university.
It's the same thing.
I say.
Really?
Yeah. still think you could do the I'm just saying you could do the masters in your spare time. You've obviously got a lot of it. I'm going to invite Caroline to speak, and then we're going to hear from Jeanette, who is equally impressive. But let's start with Caroline, and then we'll go to you, Jeanette, if that's okay.
Am I speaking here, or?
Just do it from the cloud that you permanently live on, that we worship you on.
I'm just going to sit. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be here, and as anyone who subscribes to my newsletter will know, I am a huge fan of the Women's Budget Group, and I have been ever since I had the opportunity to sit in their budget meeting when I was studying for my master's, which I almost completed back in 2012. So it's been a long-term love affair from my side, at least. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes now giving you a whistle-stop tour of the gender data gap. So first of all, what do I mean when I say gender data gap? So very simply, the vast majority of information that we've collected globally and continue to collect has been collected mainly in men. So everything from medical data to urban planning data to economic data. And this means that pretty much everything in the world, from the car you drive to the medical treatment you receive, to the phone that I see in many of your hands right now, to the apps on that phone, even the economy, has been designed to work mainly for men. And that means that most things in the world just don't work that well for women. So I'm just going to give you one example of how this works out, and I'm going to talk about cars because I think it's one of the clearest examples of how our tendency to think of men as if they're gender neutral can ultimately end up with dead women. So, for decades, the only car crash test dummy that was used was based on the body of an average American male, because of course, the average American male's body is the same as the average human's body. And this is still the dummy that is used in the vast majority of car crash testing. There is what is called a female car crash test dummy, but this is actually just a very scaled down version of the male dummy, which is fine, because obviously women are just small men. Anyway, the small male dummy is used only in the passenger seat, because obvious. Now, the obvious problem with this situation is, of course, that women are not actually just scaled-down men. There are differences in, for example, muscle mass distribution, differences in spinal flexibility, differences in the pelvis, all of which make a difference to how our bodies react in the event of a crash. So just to give you one example, talking about the seatbelt. Now, the seatbelt has been designed to catch on your pelvis, or I should say catch on your pelvis if you're a man. Because, of course, it's been designed to catch on the hip bones of the male pelvis, and that is not exactly the same as the hip bones of the female pelvis. The idea is that your bones are more able to withstand the force of a crash than your soft tissue. But the trouble is that because it's been designed to catch on male hip bones, it can ride up on a woman. This is exactly what happened to Maria Kuhn. She was in a car crash, her belt rid up, crushing her small intestine to her spine, rupturing it, and causing it to leak blood, acid, and air into the rest of her abdomen. Now, as you can imagine, this can obviously be fatal. Let's not even get started on seatbelts for pregnant women because they don't exist. The other obvious problem with the current setup is, as I hinted at earlier, women drive. And in fact, research from the US shows that the majority of the deaths and injuries that are suffered from women in car crashes are actually women who were in the driving seat. Now, is this at all related to the fact that we don't even use a small, scaled-down male dummy in the driver's seat? Who knows? We don't have the data. Now, this is just one example, but the impact of the gender data gap, of our bias that the average male can comfortably stand in for the average female, the average human, is everywhere. And that while there has been some progress in some ways, with more governments and companies and organizations realizing that this is in fact a serious problem that we need to address, in other ways we are massively taking our eye off the ball, and it's potentially getting worse. And what I'm talking about here is the rollout of AI. Now, I haven't got a lot of time here to go into this, so briefly, AI doesn't just reflect our biases. It amplifies them, and by a significant amount. And this means that the AI is not just going to be as bad as the doctor that misdiagnoses you because he's been trained predominantly on male data. The AI, which has also been trained predominantly on male data, is going to be worse. And the problem with this is that we are introducing AI everywhere, from hiring and firing, and yes, even into medicine and policy making, without any of the safeguards or, importantly, the gendered analysis that will prevent us from making our world worse instead of better. So in the US, for example, the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration, has approved over 130 AI medical devices to be used on patients. In the UK, we don't actually know how many are being currently used because we're not collecting the data, if you can believe that. It's all decentralized, and also there are non-disclosure agreements with private companies that prevent us from finding out, which is obviously fine, because non-disclosure agreements are much more important than patient health. Anyway, on that depressing note, I'm going to wrap up and pass over to Jeanette, who I'm sure will be more jolly. I'd just like to leave you with one thought. Data isn't just abstract numbers. Data drives our world. It drives the decisions and the systems that affect every single one of us. So it really, really matters when we leave out half the world. And finally, always, always sex disaggregate your data. Thank you.
I hear you say, is one OBE really enough to have in the panel? Because Jeanette, I've had the privilege to work with Jeanette, who also has an OBE. I'm just saying, no one.
You don't have one.
Sometimes I get a lollipop if I'm good. You know. Jeanette was the chair of the London Assembly for 5 terms, having previously been the Special Advisor on Equality to the Royal College of Nursing, where she started her career. I had the privilege of working with Jeanette because she represented my local community and saw firsthand the work that she was doing on special educational needs and also tackling female genital mutilation. I also often saw that we were treated as interchangeable, because obviously we were the lady that you needed to have so that no one could accuse you of having a manel for local community events, or whether we were speaking at things.
I was a very good Stella.
I wasn't as good enough, Jeanette. We know that.
I take that.
But Jeanette has massive experience of the local and direct application, not just of the absence of data around gender, but also diversity in of itself. Because often what happens is, even if you can get people to talk about women, women are seen as like a lump of plastic, because we're all obviously the same and interchangeable. The first woman who wrote about that was actually Margaret Thatcher, who wrote about it and her frustration in the shadow cabinet in the 1970s. So of course everything has moved on well, I feel. Jeanette, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stella. Thank you. Stella, I'm just going to tell you quickly that sometimes it's good when you meet that bias. Sometimes. I was in Parliament to ticket to go and see Nelson Mandela representing the Royal College of Nursing. And I was there standing, and this gentleman came up to me and said, "Oh, Miss Abbott, come with me. I'll take you to your seat. Never one to miss an opportunity." I said, "Yes," went into Diane mode. And I followed him. And he sat me on the 3rd row at the end. And I thought, wow. And as I was going up these rows, I was seeing my colleagues, and I was just going. And up I strutted to the end of the 3rd row. It meant that I was guaranteed to shake his hand. And Alice Morn was sitting next to me, and she said to me, "Jeanette, I thought Diane was here." And when I told her, she said, "Oh, they are bees. They think all black women are the same." And so I was there and shook hands with Nelson Mandela. And I haven't washed their hands since. So that's just some of the strange ways that bias works. So good morning to you all. And as many of you have heard, I've spent the past 40 years and more on the front line of campaigns for race and gender equality. And I would say from the cradle to the grave. Because for many of us, we're born into that space where gender and race and all our many other characteristics overlap and join together. And imagine that weight. Imagine that weight. So with you in carrying your weight, but I just want you always to remember the other sisters that their weight is maybe 1,000-fold. The first campaign I led was in the first year of senior school, and it was to do with navy knickers. This is me making them laugh. Now, who remembers navy knickers? Come on, yeah. And I now have you thinking, where's she going with this? The campaign issues had the unanimous support of all the first-year pupils. The organisers, myself and the netball team, we thought that we really weren't, being dealt with justly, as the second, third and fourth year girls could wear shorts and some nice little skirts. So we decided we were going to go on strike. Luckily for us, we had a really thoughtful and engaging and supporting head of year. And she said, you know what? You're right. There is an injustice here, if you like, and we'll get the policy change. So yes. So I often say to young women that for me was their first taste of success, and that has led me on to many a great campaign ever since. And I would say the most enduring has been my involvement in working towards elimination of the gender pay gap, and as I said earlier, the equally important intersectionality or the interconnectedness that gender has with other important individual characteristics such as race, disability, age, class, sexuality, religion, and a whole range of other individual characteristics. So let me just share an example with you of the time when I was an industrial relations officer. We, and I'll speak for myself, I was frequently advised to urge black female clients to choose whether they wanted to pursue their claim for unlawful discrimination, either on the basis of race or gender. The system wasn't able, couldn't see that there was a black woman standing here and that it was indivisible. She couldn't decide whether she was going to be black, And the forces that were working against her, those systemic forces, really worked against her at both levels. So when you have somebody who is intent on discriminating against you because they hate, I'll say this, because it is about hate. It is about ignorance, about race, and also about your promotion prospects. That then creates this gap that you never can widen. You never can widen. All you can do, and all I can say is, you start to work towards making a change for the next generation. That's what you have to do, because you will, and I'm glad to say that I've seen over the years the changes that's been brought about. I think it was 2013 when I've just got a note of it here, when the TUC produced a report that showed, it was to mark Equal Pay Day on November 2013, and it showed that women earned an average of 15%, so you could say up to £5,000 less than men. So for every pound a man earned, a woman was taking home 85p. The models have changed since then. So I then got into gear, and I really focused laser-like beams at Sadiq Khan, because I was determined that given that City Hall and the GLA has an equality duty, that equality duty should work for the women of London. And I'm happy to say the GLA then produced their annual audit and encouraged businesses to do the same. Not many have done it, so there's still work to be done there. But going to what Caitlin was saying, there's a rich source of information there that I'm happy to have been part of establishing, the GLA data index. If you don't know about it, it's free and it has absolutely everything in it. That was used by the GLA, across the GLA group. And if you don't know, the GLA group is the Metropolitan Police Authority, Transport for London, all of the development agencies that you can see, and itself. And so that is impact, that's clout. And so over the years, and I haven't got the latest figures with me, but it'll be online, we've seen that gap narrow. And it's narrowed. It's not to do with people in the same job not getting the same pay. It's to do with the inclusion of, say, black women and moving away those structural barriers so that they can then progress in their careers. And so what you'll see if you look at, say, 2012 to now, you'd see that maybe black women could be found, you know, where would we find them? Say it's a 7th floor building, they'd be in the basement. But they've moved up those escalators, and you can find them throughout that organization. So glad to be here. I am so glad that Caitlin's work is going to really take us down to that local level. Because you know who can really make change? Local government. Because I was a local councillor, and I'm telling you, give a strong council, I say led by a woman, there are a few, the data, you will get the change. So, looking forward to your work, Caitlin. Thank you very much.
Do you know, it's made me realise why I haven't got my OBE, because my first campaign when I was 15 was actually to do with biscuits. It was the Nestle Baby Milk Action campaign. If people remember that, I was very concerned about Nestle and what they were doing to women in the developing world. So I campaigned and successfully encouraged my school to remove all Nestle products.
That's amazing.
Well, it was for a day. But in an all-girls school, even it taught me a very valuable lesson about campaigning, because if you remove all the Kit Kats and there's nothing to replace them, people's commitment to the cause doesn't last very, very long. So it taught me a lot about the importance of planning ahead in campaigning. But yes, that's possibly why I haven't got my OBE yet. I removed the chocolate.
You should have thought about girls and their images.
Absolutely. I should have thought about that 4 p.m. moment when everyone was hungry. I'm going to ask some questions to the panel now to start the discussion going, and then I want to open it up to the floor. We have some people with microphones, I believe. Fantastic. 1, 2, brilliant. But I'm going to start with Caitlin, because I think what's really, really fascinating about what you're talking about is not just collating this data, but drilling down. And I wonder if you could tell us a little more about what you're seeing in terms of the regional diversity and the disparities that you're picking up, and the fact that you're going to such a localized level, and whether at the moment there's any correlations or causations within that you think are interesting for us to consider when perhaps these guys then start picking apart the data with you.
So I wish I could answer this question, but we're still in the process of harmonizing the data to the same geographical level. So we don't know this, but we know from a lot of the data on employment especially that there's a lot of regional variation in pay, employment rates, part-time employment rates. And on that kind of data, we do also have an intersectional picture. So if I may go back to the example of Greater Manchester, we know that employment rates vary for different groups of women. So for instance, women of Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnicity, their employment rate is only 32%. And that's under half the rate for all women in Greater Manchester. And if we look at disabled women in Greater Manchester, in 2022, it was 51%, which is lower than the employment rate for GB as a whole, which is 55.5%. So on more, or on certain types of data, we can really drill down to the local area and also explore this intersectionally. And we just see the value of that for policy. Yeah, as Jeanette said, local councils can do a lot. This is just invaluable information for them to be able to react and make sure that the people in their communities are, yeah, looked after. So give me, maybe in a year's time, I'll be able to give you a very detailed breakdown of the different indicators we're looking at.
And the issue about Northern Ireland, is it that the data doesn't exist or it's a different data set? Because that's really fascinating. As someone who's done a lot of work on women's rights and with the women's sector in Northern Ireland, that is really fascinating. But is it that they're different data sets or there's no data set at all?
There's very limited data.
Wow.
And I think, from my understanding, that has to do with the fact that Northern Ireland is not part of the Equality Act, which, where the data collection mandate is regulated.
So it'd be good, couldn't it, if, I don't know, I'm just thinking about Jim or Sammy or Ian. There is Carla in the House of Commons from the DUP. We're as interested in the fate of 51% of the population as they are about those that they feel are not yet born. Just thinking about those things. Liz, one of the challenges here that we often find when we talk, and I've experienced it in my own career, is that people then problematize women. How and what can we do to contextualize this data within the broader context, which is the environment that we're asking women to talk in? So what can we do to support you in the Women's Budget Group in making the argument that just because you're identifying the differences that women are experiencing, it's not that women are the problem here that we need to sort out?
I think, we've talked about local data and the importance of local data. We know that women are more likely to be users of public services, and there are differences in the way in which men and women use transport, for example. So women are more likely to need to do multiple journeys before they go to work. And we need to see those local groups having the confidence to use data to explain to decision makers what it is that they're seeing and what it is that they need. And that's why the project I work on is the local data project. A lot of the women that are here today, I'm looking at some women that I've trained and worked with, all of them are working locally because they know that they've got to hold their councils to account. And I think that we're seeing sort of increased interest of local councils to be having equalities panels, which are women's talking shops, and women can sit down together and talk about what the problem is. But unless we can measure differences, we can't then go to the local decision makers, and importantly the person that holds the money, and say, we need you to spend money on this for us because this is holding us back. This is stopping women from getting to work. This is holding back our local economy. So here we're going to use some census data to prove to you how many people this is affecting. Can we have a budget allocation, please, so that we can fix the problems? And that work has to be done locally, which is why I spend so much time talking to local women's organisations and that grassroots.
And Jeanette, you talked very powerfully about the escalator, and I think one of the challenges, you and I are both victims of what I also like to call, I've got a lot of terms for these things, so I spend a lot of time thinking about them, the Piers Morgan effect. Because Piers Morgan will tell you that we have equality in this country. He'll say we had a lady queen, and we had a lady running the Metropolitan Police for a while, and we had... Well, we had ladies on banknotes. I mean, why would you want them on the other side? That's just greedy. There was a kind of like, we could see there were some visible women, and there might be some women maybe at the start of their careers, but the escalator, the pipeline, was where those barriers were facing. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the work that you did with some of those very, very powerful public institutions to tackle the kind of in-betweener group of people, that what we see so often, which is women coming into industries, perhaps as graduates and youth, and then one or two at the top, but this bulge in the middle where people fall out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I could pass it on to my colleague who's at the back there, who's the chair of the Fabian's Women Network, because it's these sort of issues that come up in discussion. How do we deal with these challenges that we face? I think it comes down to really some basic things. like getting an organisation, which I did with the Metropolitan Police, to recognise that they had to take specific actions. So, for instance, one of the actions that they went for was, if you like, matching themselves up with women. So that, for example, I had met or the ranks in police, and it's dreadful. Spent 10 years and still can't get it right. But say she was a sergeant who was working over in Brixton, and I matched her up with a chief inspector at, we were then at the Met's headquarters, and the arrival of this amazing black women into that building, onto that floor, into that team, changed the narrative. And it also helped her because she then could understand some of the blocks, the sort of the pathway that she would have to take to get into that seat. So, you know, and it, I think is how you work as well. You have to work collegiately. You have to take charm, and you do have to take biscuits, you know, because I do believe a meeting without biscuits is like a poor meeting. And so you have to use everything that you've got, all your networks, and then, you know, ask people to do something that they can achieve, you know. We sometimes forget what they call the low-hanging fruit. Go for them first. You know where you're going, you know. You're going to the first woman to be a Metropolitan Commissioner. You know you're going there, but there's a lot of work within the system, and so you've got to be committed to doing that long term, and as I say, working collaboratively. And then,
Caroline, I mean, at this point, we obviously have to ask the obvious question in all of these issues: what about the men's? A lot of women I know who've read your book have had the kind of righteous anger moment about it. What response have you had from men, particularly men in decision-making roles, to the data when you have shown them what you have?
Well, that's obviously a very important question, and I'm going to answer it via the medium of transport. So I was just thinking when Liz was talking, you know, about the importance of being able to show the data of how men and women travel differently, because of course, as with everything else, our public transport system has been designed around the travel patterns of men, who are more likely to drive and more likely to commute in a very simple way. And so it is partly about collecting the data and sex disaggregating the data, but it's also actually about how you analyze and present the data, and this is one of the very important things that most transport authorities are getting wrong, is that the classic way of analyzing data is to do it by what is the purpose of your trip. And what is generally done is that all the travel for employment, for paid employment, is grouped together. And all other types of travel is separated out. So shopping, escorting, and it's mixed in leisure travel and travel done for unpaid care work, which is majority done by women. And the problem with the way of presenting the data like that is that it seems like the number one reason that people are traveling, far and away, the number one reason people are traveling is paid employment. But if you extract all the travel done for unpaid care work and group it all together as we do for paid employment and separate it out from the leisure travel, there is a 1% difference between the number of trips taken for paid employment and the number of trips taken for unpaid care work, and it is basically mainly women doing that travel. And so when you look at the data in that way, it becomes very, very clear that to design our public transport solely around paid employment doesn't make any sense, because that's not how people are using the system. But because we have considered it only from the perspective of paid employment, because we've considered it basically from the perspective of men, that's how we've ended up with the transport system that we have. How do I relate this to how men respond to this? Well, actually, a man whose name I forget now, because all men look the same to me as well, he got in touch with me from the Manchester Transport Authority.
Wasn't
having
Andy
heard
Burnham?
What?
Wasn't
No, it was not. I've heard of him.
Just checking.
He might have been called Mike. And that's a man name, such a classic man name. Anyway, he got in touch, having heard me speak about this issue, and wanted me to put him in touch with an urban planner in Madrid, who I mentioned in my talk, who had actually done this work in Madrid of collating all the unpaid travel, and he wanted to be put in touch with her to find out how she did it and how they could apply it in Manchester. So there are actually some men who are hearing this and wanting to make changes, which is really fantastic. You know, that is a man in a position of power. And actually that makes me think as well, you know, the question you were asking Jeanette about, you know, we have some women rise to the top, and then we've got this rump of women languishing in the middle or the bottom. And I actually think it is the responsibility of leaders, whether they are male or female, whoever they happen to be, it is their responsibility to chase the data, collect the data, analyze the data, and use that data to address this problem of women languishing in the middle. Like, what are the steps that are preventing this? I mean, there's one, you know, there's the classic Sheryl Sandberg example of getting pregnancy parking put in, you know, and that was the result of her having...
get pregnant when you park? What? Now they tell me.
She was pregnant and struggling to walk across the car park at Google. She got pregnancy parking put in. You know, it's a small thing, but it will have made a difference for all the women who work at that office, who then go on to get pregnant. And she was in a leadership position, and that's why she was able to do that. You know, the other women who got pregnant weren't able to do that. So it really is the responsibility of leaders to use both their experiences and the data in order to address these gaps.
Fantastic. I'm going to open this up to the floor, and I'm also going to ask all of our panel to think about how we tackle probably the biggest question. Actually, the Sheryl Sandberg one is a really good example of this, which is, what do we do about the backlash that will come? We've already seen this. The brilliant work the Women's Budget Group has done has led the amazing work that people like Jolie Brearley and Pregnant and Screwed have done to get childcare funding in this country. It's not even, the ink isn't dry on Jeremy Hunt's note saying that they would put some money into childcare, and already you are seeing the backlash that says that this is terrible to fund childcare because women really want to be at home with their baby. Nobody ever asks the men, do they? But the backlash will come. So I want you all to think about, in your questions, and also I want the panel to think about, how do we preempt the backlash that this data will generate? Because I suspect it will be very powerful. If you'd like to ask a question, please do put your hand up and introduce yourself. I don't have biscuits, but we can have politeness. Let's start over here, yes.
Hi, my name's Erin. I was just wondering about how we feel the Boundary Commission reviews and the ward reviews are going to affect the work that you're doing, but also how it'll affect political decisions locally. I'm a local councillor, but I'm also the women's branch chair, and our CLP is getting split 4 ways. We're very sociable beings, women, and I think we rely on having our tribe around us. And I think I'm just wondering how many other places in the UK are going to be affected by those, and what considerations can be put in place to support or help alleviate those issues.
Next, I'll make you run, basically. Come to this lady here. And we have to take the chair of the Fabians Network, so I'll get you back there. So, yes, sorry. We'll come to you in the next round, I promise.
Hi, my name's Jane Binion. I'm from Lancashire. I run a women's organisation called the Growing Club. Probably not a direct question, just my mind is going that. So it was the data you presented, Liz, on women's employment, the average pay. And so my thoughts went, I don't know any woman on that amount of money. What does that mean? What were the groupings around income on the census? And also then led me to think about the way working class women are left behind all the time. As gender equality, we're still going for, you know, women getting through the glass ceiling. So we're looking in that direction all the time and forget to look at working class women. So I'm in Lancashire. I know that data will be different anyway. But so lots of thoughts, probably rather than a question. And my final thought on it was, okay, if the government thinks women all earn £37,000, then they're not going to want to give nurses a wage rise, or any other woman for that matter, because they think we're all fine.
Thank you, Jane. And then...
Thank you. Hi, Mariana Masters, Chair of the Fabian Women's Network. I have spent... I've spent 20 years in the corporate world before being in politics, and one of the jobs I had was an account director in an insight company that collected data and produced results, and I would go to corporations and sell this service. We need to think about actually the research companies as well. I mean, you produce great research, but say you were, even local authorities would go to a panel of suppliers, and the rot sets in when you look at the whole marketing research industry. So how do we move them on? Because you can get research, but the cost per thousand is just so cost prohibitive that, you know, you're looking, when you start sort of factoring in all the things that you need to actually get to real data, it just becomes inaccessible. So how do we change that?
Brilliant. In order to get as many questions in as possible, I'm going to come to each of the panelists individually just on things that you've asked, so we can go to another round. So absolutely, we will get you in. So please do keep your hands up. Caitlin, because it feels like quite a specific question about boundary, I feel your pain, and I promise you lots of my colleagues in Parliament are feeling your pain, but that probably doesn't help. And from a practical research perspective, it must be a nightmare when they move the boundaries.
Well, I'm not sure what the ONS's position on this is. We are pretty dependent on the geographical areas that the ONS set, just because we're getting the data secondhand. So ideally, what we want to do is look at middle layer super output areas, which are typically made up of 4 to 5 lower layer super output areas. So they cover up to 6,000 households. So that is what we're going to look at and try to get as much data onto that level. But yeah, you can imagine.
Which is different. So the Boundary Commission Review, for those who don't know, uses only wards, which is a higher level to a super output area. So that should be, you should be able to capture it within the super output area, because the ward itself might move constituencies, or it might even move local authorities, but the super output area will remain constant, which doesn't help you in terms of your CLP being split up, but does help the research challenge. Liz, Jane's questions about, brilliant, lots of different questions about average pay and means and median. I remember that from maths.
Well, I mean, book me to come and talk to you. I mean, I can talk for a long time about means, modes, medians, all taught through looking at the data, and, you know, I use gender pay gap data to start picking apart some of those questions that you're doing. And I think this answers your question, Stella. How do we deal with the backlash? Well, we look at the numbers, and we get as many women looking at the numbers as possible, because every time I present one number, I've got 5 questions there that we can then go and look, and I know where the data is. So I could answer all of those questions if you know, we were in sort of that training session, which, by the way, if you're a voluntary organisation, is entirely free. So do book us, and we can start coming and look at these things. The other thing that we can do with the sort of capacity work that you're doing, I mean, I know that you're working with women in business, and yeah, I mean, that's something that is personal to me as well. Gender pay gap data, of course, doesn't include self-employed women. I know we're being joined this afternoon by a brilliant woman who went, look at this, there's a gender data gap. We don't know really where women are running their businesses. So she went and got the money herself to do it. I mean, what a brilliant thing Gender Index is, because, you know, we have got women who are starting these conversations and going out and plugging those data sets so that we can start talking about it. And of course, you know, when you start talking about gender pay gap data, well, that doesn't include how many hours people are working. So, you know, we've got this gender earnings gap as well, which we know with the cost of living crisis, that's something that's really affecting women because they're less likely to be able to go and do overtime hours. So even if a gender pay gap is 0, women still have less stuff, because we've got all of the gender finance gap, the gender wealth gap, gender ownership gap, gender earnings gap, all of these issues. And we just need women to start looking at these numbers, talking to each other about what they actually show and what they mean, where the gaps are, where they can't see themselves in the data, and then we can hope to plug some of those data gaps for you.
Caroline, Marianne raises a very important question about the people doing the data in the first place. Have you looked at all in the data sets that you've been looking at, or the decision making to commission data, who is making the decision as to who to commission?
Sorry, that just sounded really funny. No, sorry.
Well, if you did a master's.
Yeah, I don't think that's a question for me.
Or maybe, Jem, you were talking about the work you were doing with the Met and with Sadiq in terms of commissioning people to look at these issues within organisations. What was the response that you had when you did that?
Oh, it was positive. It was positive and powerful. It goes to the point that Caroline made. The mayor wanted to be seen as the, what did he used to call himself?
Hashtag ally?
Hashtag ally. And so in order for him to deliver on that, then he had to get the whole organisation going. And it is about the leadership. It is about the leadership. It's also about continuity. And then that feeds into the backlash as well, if I can bring that together. Because what we've got to do is embed so much of our actions in such a way that a change of government doesn't sweep it away. I cried when I saw stuff being swept away. I was a Labour politician. That was swept away in areas that I'd campaigned on. And then we went into this desert space for so many years, and it happened to us at City Hall. So I absolutely believe you've got to embed the work that you're doing so that it can bend with the wind but not be blown away. And I think that's also the problem with the funding that's available, and touches on Marianne's question, that we have got to win the argument that local authorities invest money into the research that they want. It's often that they don't have enough money, so they go for the cheapest option, which is not going to help them. And what they do is they forget the absolutely wonderful resource that there is in the voluntary sector, in groups that are within their wards. So I think firstly you should look to see what's available locally, and you will find some great research there. And then, if nothing else, bring them in to pitch at the same time that you're bringing in professional consultants, because I think you'll see the difference, and then you'll be able to get the sort of data that you're looking for.
You see, it was a question for Jeanette. I don't commission data.
Just saying, I think she got her OBE first. So next round. So we've got this lady here, lady at the back. I'll make people run. She's got a stripy top, and somebody in the middle. We'll try and fit 4 in because you were so nice and your glasses are so funky. The lady here in the middle, the spotty and the William Morris pattern. I mean, how could I not go for William Morris? He's my local lad. This lady, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Penelope from Stimulus. My question is, I work with women that Caroline mentioned that languish in the middle levels and that are everyday working class women from Black and minoritized backgrounds. And one of the biggest challenges is getting people in leadership to actually understand that these women have the ability, they want to be leaders and that they want to be part of the change, but it's hard to convince them that they can also be part of this change if there's nothing coming from both sides. So how do we bridge that gap? Because the women who are in leadership are already there and they've struggled to get there, so that the odds of them actually reaching out to the women in the middle is tough. So it's, how do we get people to buy in with using data? Because I love data, and data is evidence and no one can dispute it. And yet people don't look at the data, like they see what they want to see as they only accept what they want to accept. So how do we bridge that gap so that the women in this middle level can actually be the leaders that they have the potential for?
Brilliant. And then, see here, and then if we can get the mic to... Do you want to shout your question to me and I'll repeat it back?
Yeah, so I'm Catherine Boots. I'm Director to Women's Equality Network Wales and a County Councillor as well. And my question, it's great to be here and hear more about the Gender Equality Index, which we were involved in. We were involved in the early workshops, and it's brilliant to hear about how that's all progressing. My question is, so at the Women's Equality Network Wales, we've just started a campaign which we're launching in Carers Week called Make Care Fair. It's about unpaid care, it's about childcare, and it's about paying conditions in both those sectors as well. But one of the questions I wanted to ask today is about what the panel thinks should be the childcare offer at the next general election from the different political parties. Because I think this is really important, because in Wales, the Welsh Government have announced that they want to reduce childcare. They are doing it now, but it's for such a small group of children, down to 2-year-olds. We at When Wales and with our Make Care Fair campaign are saying it should be from 6 months. It should be all women. It shouldn't just be those who are working. To be fair to Welsh Government, they have said we will put it in place also for women in training, so we've got one step further. But we want it to be for everyone and not just 2 hours a week. Also, the availability of childcare is a real issue because there's a big lack in local authorities. Just on the backlash, I'd like to say networks, I think, are so important. We all know that when we get a pile-on, having our women and our sisters around really can help. And so I would just say the networks, reach out to your networks. I'm really fortunate to be in the Fabian Women's Network, and that has just been a huge help to me. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, Catherine. And then the lady in the William Morris and the lady in the Spotty.
That's me. Thank you very much. I'm Jackie Carter. I'm an academic at the University of Manchester, but latterly I didn't become an academic until I was in my 50s, but I've been in education circles all my life. So I think the gender data gap is misrepresenting the problem. I think we have a data skills gap. So I think there's something here that you've all unpicked, and I would implore everybody in the room who isn't in the academic sector to find your local university, because they're desperate to reach out and do civic engagement activities. So I'm from Manchester. I work across Greater Manchester with Helen Pankhurst and others who are doing a lot of work around the mayor's strategy. And so I have a question on how do we get local authorities to join up what they're doing and be accountable and responsible to the strategies, in my case at the Greater Manchester level. And then how do we do it? Well, I've just walked across, my daughter's studying at LSE, she's doing a master's course in human rights. Walk across, see the Pankhurst.
She's going to finish it.
Yeah, she's going to finish it. She's going to finish it. And she's doing post-colonial queer
Tell
theory.
her not to bother finishing it.
No. But she needs a job. But that's how we do it. We are brave and we think about all the women who have gone before us, and we stop fucking around and being apologetic. We just get on and do it. So we fix the system, not the women.
Absolutely. And then finally, with the spotty top.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Hi, thank you everyone in the panel. Stella, actually my question is for you, if you don't mind.
It's not about the Kit Kats, is it? Because I now carry
it really
them round with me.
I really wanted a Kit Kat. No, my name is Cecilia. I'm a civil servant in the Home Office.
Oh.
I know, I'm so sorry. I must have committed some war crimes in my previous life. But I work in homicide prevention, and one of the main things that I find myself facing with a lot of the ministers is exactly what you were mentioning of. You mentioned the word women, and it seems that an alternative universe kind of opens up, and there isn't a linkage between that gender data without the gap, the data that, as Liz said, we have so much of, and prevention, which encompasses everything from ambulance response to mental health care to education, etc. As it's supposedly quite sort of in order to think that you may come into government in the next couple of years.
Don't worry, it won't be me.
No. But you are very much part of that party, and I would love to know what are the conversations happening within the Labour Party and other parties that bridge that gap, sorry to use that pun, to not have that alternative universe open up, but really make that gender data part of the conversation, and gender not being equal to just women, but men, non-binary people, trans people, etc.
Brilliant. Lots of questions there. Okay, I'm going to go to. All right. You start with Catherine's. Yes, I've got strong opinions on that one.
Catherine, congratulations on the work that you're doing in Wales. I spend some of my time on the border of Wales in Shropshire, and I just think we don't know enough about what's happening in Wales, because you're doing some great stuff there. I would say, my ask would, I'd have two asks of government. I would say, bring back Sure Start. And I would say, give England the educational maintenance allowance that Scotland gets. Do you get it in Wales? Oh, you see. So it's in Wales, it's in Scotland. I'm sure it's in Northern Ireland. Is it not? So let's have it in England. And I think if you brought those two major initiatives back, I've seen them change lives. I've seen them change communities. I've seen them empower women and their children. And you know what happens when you empower women and their children and their family? Things change.
Caroline, we'll go in reverse. The Penelope's challenge about the people in the middle. Mm-hmm. And also, let's be blunt about it. Sometimes, and it's a phrase, women can be their own worst enemies. Mm-hmm. I've experienced people saying to me, don't make a fuss about motherhood, because we all had to struggle, and don't reveal it. How do we use this data and use the work, whether it's your work, whether it's Caitlin's work, to challenge the idea that somehow it's an either or?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think several of the questioners in this past round raised the issue of it's not enough to have the data. How do you get people to actually listen to the data and believe the data when it tells them something different to what their priors are? That is really, really hard. And I have been really frustrated that my book was published in 2019 and still everything's pretty much the same. I really thought, publish the book, it'll all get fixed. I think a really useful tool is using the data to tell compelling stories. When you can have examples so that you're not just talking about numbers, you can talk about specifically, this is what happened in this company when they did X. That is a really, really important part of it. I also find, the whole workplace issue is one of the most, weirdly, you might not think it, but it is one of the most contentious parts of it. When you're talking about, which I often do because I like an easy life, talking about the car crash data, it's very hard to argue about that because no one loses from making cars safer for women. The truth is that some men will lose from making workplaces more equal for women. And that is a much harder case to make because no one wants to lose. And also, we don't want to admit that. We want to pretend, oh, it's better for everyone. And ultimately, yes, in the grand scheme of things, it is better for everyone. You know, it is better for business, let's say, if they have all competent people at the top rather than, or in the middle, or wherever it is, just competent people. One of my favorite studies that I came across when I was writing Invisible Women was this LSE study, which found that quotas, which we sort of think of as over-promoting women, didn't do that at all. Actually, what they did was stop the over-promotion of mediocre men. You know, so that is a difficult one, and I think that it is about pointing out, you know, specifically when we're talking about the workplace, the data is very clear that there is a strong business case for this, like it is unarguable. And I think the way to get people to listen to that data is to tell compelling stories with the data. I do also want to come in on the childcare point because, you know, I think Jeanette makes a very, very good case, and I think it is probably something that would be much easier to do than what I'm going to propose, but what I'm going to propose is universal childcare, because that's just basically what we need, isn't it? We need universal childcare. There is a very, very strong economic case for it. The economic case against it is nonsensical and short-sighted, and I think we should be ambitious. You know, we should be pushing for what we actually need and actually want and what will actually change the lives of women and change the working lives of women.
I'm going to come actually both to Liz and Katrin with the same question, because I think Jackie's point about the data skills gap and actually how do you do engagement, particularly with local universities and engagement to get those connections going and I think have the impact that, Liz, you're talking about. To start with you, Katrin, have you found kind of engaging people in the data set and some of the challenges about getting consistent data, which can often be, that can put people off because they feel like it's got to be perfect rather than it can just be good. How have you found that in terms of local groups and what can we do today in terms of the work you're going to do next to address that?
I think there's a great appetite for using data for the reasons that were mentioned, for greater accountability, also for, I mean, yeah, arguing your case. You know, in your lived experience, there's a certain thing that's happening to you. If you have the data to back it up, that is quite empowering, to use that word. Yeah, thing. And the Women's Budget Group has this amazing initiative where they work together with women's organizations. We would like to do the same with this index once we're further along to help people gain confidence in their data literacy. And yeah, to build campaigns for accountability. I know GM for Women in Manchester is doing a lot to hold the local government accountable. I know it's also run on a lot of unpaid work, so I salute you even more. And I think, again, this is an issue around money, to train up people, for us to gain confidence, and then use those analyses to argue for better responses. It is a structural problem that there's little funding and women already have limited time knowing what we know about unpaid care. And this brings me to the next point around childcare. So if I may, I would even like to go one step further and suggest, why don't we introduce an NCS, a National Care Service, where we also start thinking about care more holistically, not just childcare, but care for adults, and have that accessible on a universal basis. Just
I like this, getting more and more radical as we go to... I don't know what you're going to suggest,
no
Liz.
Pressure, Liz.
Better be good.
No burning down Parliament? I'm probably not.
Maybe not when you're ready. Take it back. Yeah, this issue of practically the work that you're doing, and doing brilliant work with the Women Budgets Group to really connect up with local groups. Tell us a bit more about what you get out today, what happens next.
So, I mean, some of the questions that have been talked about, you know, how do we support each other? How do we make sure particular women are listened to? Well, I mean, this is where I'm lucky that I'm in the Women's Budget Group, because I think, those are our principles, that we know that the way to do this is for women to meet each other, women to network, women to support each other, and, just
have that conversation with as many people as possible. And, you know, I work for an organisation where I get paid to do that. They give me money in order that I can do that. Which means that, you know, we can pick up where we've got groups of women that want to talk about the same thing. So, you know, we were talking about transport. Well, you know, one of the projects that we're actually working on proactively, you know, I've been out to Cardiff, we've been training active transport networks in Cardiff so that they can do gender responsive budgeting in Cardiff. And, you know, that's, you know, Wales is ahead of us on gender responsive budgeting. England needs to catch up on that one to make sure that, you know, the money is being spent where it needs to go so that women can get, you know, the support that they need. And that work has to be done through networking women and women teaching other women what they know. This is, you know, what the women's movement has been very good at for hundreds of years now. And this is the work. This is what we do. You know, and picking up on Jackie's point, yeah, there are loads of opportunities out there for women to join networks. You know, I know that some of the people that are joining us today are running their own mentoring schemes. Brilliant. You know, there's Fabian Women's Network, which, you know, I'm secretary of. It's an absolute pleasure to work for that network in my spare time. That's what I'm doing. So, you know, there's the challenge. Go and find another woman. Go and talk to her, find out what she knows, support her work, and she'll support your work. And, you know, eventually that noise becomes so loud that, you know, that's when change is made. But it's got to come from politicians, the media, grassroots organisations, activists, you know, everybody with that same message and that same fervour to go and, you know, get our National Care Service, to get everything that we want.
Brilliant. I also would say, go and find another woman and then sit one man down with you and explain to him what you've discovered. I'm conscious of time, but I want to take on Cecilia's question because actually it wraps it all together with your point, Jo, as well. The childcare debate in this country is a really good example of why we need the data to move the debate and the narratives that Jeanette has been talking about, and why the backlash matters, because the funding that's come forward from government, because it is actually in the wrong places, will make things worse, not better. And I say that as a mother of an under 2-year-old, as oddly enough, you can't put a 2-year-old in a cupboard. I've discovered that. I mean, they try. The fact that childcare kicks in at some random age that makes no sense, already, frankly, those mothers who could afford childcare have stayed in work, and those who couldn't have gone. The work that Marianne and her team have done is absolutely fantastic about making the economic case for universal childcare and a care service. If you haven't read it, please do share it. The challenge of what the government has done is that they've stumped up demand. It's a bit like some of the housing projects without increasing supplies. They've now told parents that you can have free childcare at an early age without actually providing the funding, which means that lots of nurseries are going to go bust. We are going to have to track that to prove the impact. It is women who will disproportionately pay the cost of that, and what will happen is then the backlash will say, but you see, women wanted to stay at home all along. In the words of the famous Admiral Akbar, it is a trap. Challenging that is about the data. That goes to your question, Celia. I would love to tell you, job done, vote for the Labour government. I shouldn't do that from a panel because I'm trying to be politically neutral about this. But actually, changing cultures, changing systems, and making it not specific to individuals is the future in all of this. And Jeanette and I watched as things like Sure Start were ripped out. But actually, they also became lower order priority issues because gender equality has always been seen as one of those things that we're going to get to. And when you have a cost of living crisis and and oddly enough, we had a pandemic and it was pregnant women who ended up disproportionately in hospitals because we were going to get to the ladies and the lady vote. One of the ways that we've managed to win some of the arguments on childcare is to make it an economic infrastructure issue and to compare it to potholes and change that narrative. Looking at where the systems are and changing those debates is critical in any political movement to making the case for the impact. All of you and what you are going to do is going to change our economy. Caroline's right. There will be people who miss out, but there'll be a lot of people who will benefit if we can show the talent that we are missing out on because the ways in which we work hold 51% of the population back. If you do nothing, hold in your heads the Chinese proverb that women hold up half the sky, because right now there are a hell of a lot of rain clouds out there and we're not even spotting them because we're not seeing that talent and that potential, let alone the diversity within women that you're talking about. That isn't going to be solved by a change of government, because that is a systematic structural challenge in this country. We've got brilliant people, don't get me wrong. So Jeanette did brilliant work within the Met. We've still got the Casey report. We've still got issues with institutional misogyny, racism, homophobia that we've had to challenge. The networking is so important because you bring people together, you make it easier to tear down those bricks. But if you want systemic and cultural change, it has to move away from one individual to a mass movement, which is why, gentlemen at the back, you have your role to play as well. Yeah, I'm going to make eye contact with you, sir. Great smile. We can't do this unless we show that systemic change will bring the revolution that we all want. And that isn't just a national care service, that is a better functioning economy and a better functioning society. Your data, no pressure, is going to be an absolute part of doing that, because right now that conversation isn't even happening in government, because no government really recognises what they're not seeing. Put it in front of them, 2 women, 1 man, whatever it takes, we will start that revolution. Please know you will always find an ally, hashtag or otherwise, in me in Parliament. Please know also that there are other brilliant women in this room. I just want to say a massive thank you to Fiona, who was a massive ally to me when she was in Parliament. Yeah, you lady. Because that's the other thing. Platform the other women who are doing amazing things. You are all brilliant, like Marianne and the Fabian Women's Network, because the data is also about the qualitative as well as the quantitative. Thank you so much to the Women's Budget Group. Thank you to a brilliant, brilliant panel. Honestly, if you haven't read Caroline's book, it is better than her doing a master's. I do have to admit that. Thank you to Liz and the work she's going to do with you all this afternoon, and Catherine. And I look forward to seeing the results and using them in Parliament in due course. Thank you.
I should now say that women, you know who you are, who are sticking with us this afternoon to listen to more of me telling you about data. We are downstairs on floor 2. There are Women's Budget Group staff that will show you how to get to that room. I'm afraid you can't all get in the lift, so the sturdier amongst you will have to go down the stairs, I'm afraid. And I will see you down there in a bit. Women online, hello, women online, and women who aren't part of that group. Rest assured, you know, it's not that you're not important and we don't want to know what you say. It's just we haven't met you yet. So do make sure you get in touch with a Women's Budget Group, because you know we can do lots of amazing work with you. You've got my email address, liz.hind@wbg.org.uk, and I will see you on a training course sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.